yeah, if I can't be honest with my struggles and honest with what's going on in my life, I can't expect my church or anyone else I meet to be honest with theirs. And it also opens, what I've noticed, it opens the door in a way that it doesn't anything else. It's like, man, I'm dealing with XYZ.
Yeah.
Like right now, God is really challenging me on this particular thing. Oh, yeah, I'm dealing with this. Awesome. Let's talk about that.
Well, Steven Guinett, we have an opportunity to sit down and chat about all things Westview Church,
I guess.
And you're kind of in the middle of all that stuff. So, Steven has been in the community for 2 to 3 years, something like that. You're one of those. We talked all the time during the pandemic about how rough it was and how people were thinking about leaving the ministry, and you actually came to a church in the midst of the pandemic. In the middle of all of it, right? Yeah. So I want to hear that story. I want to hear that what that journey was like, and maybe where you grew up and stuff like that. But also, I'm really interested to know how you look at the community you're in, because I'm interested to know if you're seeing what I'm seeing. You know, if we kind of see the same things. You've been here for a couple of years now, and so I'm interested in that. But first of all, let's start off with you and your journey. Where did you start, and how did you end up here?
Oh, so I grew up as a Christian. My whole household, all my extended family are all Christian. So I grew up in the church and in the Church of God movement. And I really didn't even consider ministry until my college-age pastor really put that fire in me. I shouldn't say fire.
Yeah, fire.
Fear is probably a better word. And so...
You want me to do what?
Yeah, I was just like, no. In my mind, I was like, no, I want a career with money and something that sounds fun.
Yeah.
Dealing with people and preaching every Sunday does not sound fun.
Well, you saw what preachers were like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to do that.
I know. I actually met a guy the other day who we got to talking, and he goes, so what do you do for a living? He's like, oh, I'm a pastor. And he goes, really? I'm like, what, were you expecting a sweater vest? Because that's what I grew up
and
with.
Big hair.
Yeah.
But you can't do the big hair.
Really? And so I wasn't really ever thinking about ministry until my pastor really put that in my head. And then that really came to fruition when I felt God call me and 5 other friends to go to the very small country of Moldova for a 3-month mission trip. And that really changed.
Where's Moldova?
Yeah, so Moldova is the only reason most people know about it, if they've ever heard about it now, is because it's right next to Ukraine.
Oh,
and what's going on over there. And so, very small country. It used to be a part of Russia, then Yugoslavia, then it became its own country. I think I'm technically older than Moldova as a country.
Weird.
Yeah, it was kind of weird because they had their like big national day, and they're like, "Yeah, 15 years old." I'm like, I'm 21. Anyway, so God really got a hold of me there in Moldova and just reaffirmed, like, yeah, this isn't your pastor calling you or telling you you might think about it. No, this is God.
Well, what was it about it, though? I mean, what does it mean when you say he got a hold of you? What did he get a hold of?
So my pastor planted the seed and the idea of it.
Yeah.
And looking back, all the fighting I was doing was because in the back of my mind, I knew that was something I was probably being led to.
Yeah.
And because I had volunteered in youth ministry, I had volunteered in middle school ministry, I had helped in church a ton. And so I loved that side of it, but I never thought at all about the leadership side of it until finally my pastor put that in my head. And then that's just sticking in the back of my head for a few years. And then finally in Moldova, I was doing my nightly devotions, and I was reading through scripture, and I came across Matthew where he's like, some are called to be preachers and teachers and pastors. And I was like, and when I say grab a hold, I in some of the most clearest sense, it was like someone grabbed my shoulder at that moment. Like it's the second I read the word pastor, and I was like, really, God? And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, God, if you really want me to be a pastor, this is really my calling, please make it evident to me. Just show me something. I don't care what it is. And
I mean, more than showing you a word in the Bible.
Right? I know, right? Being like the 21-year-old of like, no,
I need more.
No, I need, I had money, not pastor. Anyways, so we were in Moldova for 3 months, and that night was really powerful for two reasons. One, because God really hit me with that, and then two, because that same night, it was a clear night when I went to bed. I got woken up in the middle of the night by one of the most crazy lightning storms I've ever been able to see. One lightning struck like 10 feet from our window, and man, I can't even describe how white everything went in that moment. And then I was like, oh man, that was crazy. Put my head back on the pillow, and then
you weren't blind, were you? Because
No.
this story sounds kind of familiar.
And so I was just like, oh, really, God? Okay. And maybe that was his sign or not, but either way, I took it serious from that point on.
Yeah.
And when I got home, I started talking to my pastor again, and then other people started to confirm that in me. And so I was like, okay, God, I'll pray about it. And then I still fought it for a few more years until I just couldn't anymore. And then I went to Mid-America Christian University in Oklahoma and earned my essentially youth ministry degree in Oklahoma. It's also where I met my wife at college. And
did you think somehow that youth ministry was safer than lead pastor ministry?
Yeah. And in many ways, I had been around youth ministry so much and I loved youth ministry. And when I was a youth pastor, I loved doing it. And, but yeah, I think on some level it was definitely felt safer than jumping into a senior pastor role.
I just say that because I started out as a lead pastor because we planted a church. I had no desire to do youth ministry. That looked like the hardest job in the world. I'd rather lead a church any day than I would lead a youth group.
Man,
although they act very similar, the people that are involved.
I know. You never really lose that side of yourself, but yeah, for me, it just seemed like the right fit, and I never had God ever push back on that.
Right,
and that's all where my experience was, and so it was a lot of fun. But yeah, you want to get frustrated, definitely go into youth ministry, and. But every time I look back at just all the youth that I still see on Facebook who are graduating or now having, make myself really feel old is when I see them having kids now and getting married. And so it's awesome to see that, especially when I get to see some of them from time to time, whether they're coming out here for whatever reason. One of my former youth, his wife now is from Woodland. Mm-hmm. And then he came out to visit the family and everything for like a week. And he knew I lived out here. And he didn't even bother to call or anything. Wow. And so I had to get on him about that. But
as a good youth leader would.
Yeah.
So when you were in college, were you looking for a wife? Or did that sneak up on you too?
That sneaked up in a different way. Because when I went into college, I was 25. I was the third oldest person who was living on campus. And my roommate was the second oldest. There was one other guy who's a really great friend. He was the oldest who was living on campus. And so all of us were like, it's 8 o'clock. I'm going to go to bed.
Oh, come on.
Whereas all the other kids and like 18, 19-year-olds are like walking into class and they're like half asleep. We're like, dude, when did you go to bed? And they're like, we didn't. Like, and so it was different in that I got there and immediately I'm older than almost everybody. And so I wasn't looking for a wife. And even when I did have a girlfriend in college, and then we broke up. And so after that, I was just kind of like, I looked around my school and I was like, they're either too young or too immature. I'm not, whatever reason, I'm like, I don't want to date a girl from here.
Yeah.
Next thing I know, I meet my wife who's at the school and, but is older like myself, just not living on campus, which is why we never ran into each other. And so that snuck up on me on that, like, I'm not going to date anyone from MacU. Next thing I know, I'm dating someone from MacU. Yeah. And kind of the rest is history with that. We have 2 kids now, and we've been in Minnesota, Oklahoma, and now Washington.
How did your wife feel about being married to a pastor?
She was all thrilled about it, actually. I know it was really weird. 2 things that were weird, because she's like, "Oh, that's awesome! I think that's amazing that you want to be a pastor. I'm all about that." And then second was like, "I really want to live in Washington." I'm like, "Okay, sounds good." And so after,
where were you living then? Well, that was in
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, but where did you grow up?
I grew up here in Washington.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah,
so she said, "I want to go back to where you."
Essentially, yeah. She's like, "I've always felt like I should be living in Washington." Like, okay, cool. I don't have to convince you of that point. And then if we ever go back,
yeah.
So, and then after college, I became a youth pastor in a very small town in rural Minnesota. It's always funny when someone says they're from a small town.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Oh, where are you from?" I'm like, "Oh, this town, it's really small." I'm like, "How big?" I'm like, "Oh, 5,000 people." It was a town of 500. Yeah, you don't know small until you realize that the only 2 things in town are really the post office and the gas station.
Yeah.
But it was also funny because the church its location was right off the highway, and it was the largest church in town, and it became the unofficial face of the town.
Yeah.
And that got really funny when my brother, who's a firefighter, and at the time he was a forest firefighter, he was on a fire somewhere in Washington. I can't remember where, but there were firefighters from all over the country coming to fight this, including someone from Minnesota. And he met them and was like, "Hey, have you heard of the town Bertha, Minnesota?" And they're like, "Bertha? Oh, right. It's a really small town. There's like one thing there, and it's this big church." And my brother called me and told me that, and me and my pastor really laughed about that. So
felt pretty good.
Yeah, it felt pretty good. Like, oh, well, we're known as the thing in the town. So
how did the Lord pry you out of that city into your next adventure?
Man, I don't even know how to describe it as far as prying. So I got to Minnesota at the end of 2015. My wife and I were married early 2016. And we were there until the end of 2019. So we moved here January 2020, which is perfect timing.
Perfect.
And
you had a good month.
A good month. And I remember driving across the country and hearing about the COVID and everything. And I'm like, it's just like another flu kind of thing. It's not going to be anything. Yep, I was wrong. And so over those 4 years, it was a heck of a lot of fun, and God did so many amazing things, and I got to meet so many youth and get to have relationships with them. Some of the things that I inherited were just a blast, and some of them I thought were just kind of weird, because at the end of every school year, we didn't have youth during the summer because in Minnesota, everybody's off doing something. It's the land of 10,000 lakes, and so they're camping, fishing, hunting, whatnot. And so at the end of the school year, we'd have this big party, get together, and they'd play Ultimate Frisbee is the big game they would play. But instead of a Frisbee, they would use a cow tongue.
Tongue?
Tongue, like a, yeah.
Or dung.
Tongue.
Oh.
And so...
Because I've heard of the other one. Cow tongue.
I know. Oh, that's what my reaction was to cow tongue. And then so, yeah, they'd be playing Ultimate Frisbee, and there's just this cow tongue flapping in the wind. And
I would get out of there so fast. You guys are just weird.
It was weird, but what got really weird is when a number of the youth, it was like their tradition every year to go cook it and then take a bite of it. I'm like, dude, I know. Don't look at me. This was a Minnesota thing.
Yeah.
And
I'm married now. Don't talk to me about it.
And so over those 4 years, it was just an amazing time. And of course, it always has its challenges.
Yeah.
But something that started to happen was I started to let my spiritual life go, in the sense of I little by little stopped getting into my devotionals, and I started to get weighed down by just the pressure of ministry and everything. And over the course of time, I started to realize some things were off in my ministry. My team started to become less healthy.
Yeah.
And then I didn't even recognize, actually, my pastor and I both recognized essentially at the same time, something's really off about what's going on with youth ministry. And it was just one thing after another. Either one of my team would quit all of a sudden, or there was just a lot more conflicts going on. There were more issues coming up. And my pastor and I were both kind of like, we don't know what's going on. And then we just kind of realized both at the same time. And my team had become unhealthy. And then looking back, I realized, because what's going on with your ministry can be a reflection of what's going on with the pastor.
Yeah, yeah.
And so my spiritual life had degraded to a point that I don't even know if I was able to hear from God at that time. And I got through the mid-2019 where I realized, okay, something needs to change. I'm starting to recognize that I'm not really doing this through God's strength. I'm doing it through my own.
Right.
And which is never
Which
good.
is a scary place to be.
Yeah. And in 2020, the late 2020, I was listening to N.T. Wright speak about a number of things, but then he says something to the effect of, the number one reason he sees that pastors get burnt out and leave ministry is because they stop having their own devotional life. And I was like, well, thanks. Now you tell me. And ultimately that's what happened to me, was my spiritual life was just gone. And then late 2019, I got called into a surprise board meeting. I had no clue this was coming. And my board and my pastor asked me to resign, which is one of the hardest things I've ever gone through.
Yeah.
And I had the option, per our church's bylaws, that I could fight it. But the very fact that they're asking me this is something that I really want to fight, because it's going to cause more conflict in the church. And if they're asking me, that's kind of it. I don't know if anyone, I don't ever even trust myself with
Right.
the youth ministry. And so
when they had that conversation with you, did you already know something inside was not right?
yeah. And that was kind of the thing. It was interesting looking back is I recognized I was the problem, and that my spiritual life was the problem. And so I recognized that, but then it was like the next day almost.
Wow.
Where I'm like, and so it was just, that was a confirmation of everything. Yeah. And so it was just a complete snowball effect of, I recognized my own fault in all of this, and that my spiritual life is dead. I can't hear from God because it's dead. And then I'm getting this confirmation in a way that I can't deny.
Yeah.
And it was a very somber meeting. Most of the board, who I all love dearly, good friends and amazing brothers and sisters in Christ. I don't know if, looking back, I don't know if any of them actually ever lifted their head, because they were really sad about this.
Yeah.
My pastor was actually the one who spoke the whole time and led that whole meeting. And we did an exit interview, and I think it was the next day. It was actually the next day, if I remember right. And we both go into this meeting, and he's like, "How are you doing?" I was like, I didn't sleep. And something that still chokes me up today is that he looked back at me and was like, "Neither did I." And so we were both in this place of like, this is just sad. We didn't want any of this to happen, but
how honest is all that.
Yeah, and
That's so cool.
And that's the thing. I look back and just have absolute love and respect for my pastor, because he was real, and he wasn't trying to be this, I have to be this pastor point of view, leader point of view. No, he was just real. And like, I didn't sleep last night. Wow. That was horrible for me to have to ask you all of that. And so we talked, and we're still good friends. And he was actually instrumental in much of my success, because there's a distinct disconnect between what you learn in school as far as ministry and what actually doing ministry. And when I got into youth ministry, I was like, I'm not prepared at all. I was like, 4 years did nothing. And even getting into ministry, then it was, oh, wait, there's this, and this that I should have learned in school that they didn't teach me because X, Y, Z. And so it was just like, man, there's a disconnect. And so he really filled in that disconnect with a lot, and just gave his wisdom as far as what it looks like to be a pastor day to day. And so 2019, end of 2019, they asked me to resign. And I think we were gone by end of January. And we moved back to Washington because it was really the only place I had any prospect of a job. Mm-hmm. My grandfather started a masonry company, Guinett Masonry, in 1955, which then my aunt and uncle took over. And I had worked there for 5 years, doing that when I was after high school. And so I knew that job, and so I came back hoping there was a job there. Unfortunately, no, because all of their work was out of state.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was Yellowstone, so which they're still working on. And so over time, I was just in 2020 was a really dark place for me. It was actually the first time in my life that I was really depressed. Yeah, I'm not really the type that gets depressed. Of course, everyone gets depressed from time to time, but it was the first time I really struggled with it. I told this to my family, like after I got to Westview. I told this to my family because I was like, man, 2020 was really dark. And the three things that got me through 2020 were God, my family, and The Mandalorian. It was like the only thing that gave me joy other than my family and God. And
not necessarily in that order. Yeah. Really. Depending on the day and episode. And like 2020 was, looking back, it was a dark place, but at the same time, I wouldn't trade it. Wow. I know, which is weird to say, through pandemic, through all of the doubt that I was going through, because, man, I was questioning my calling. I was questioning whether I should even go back into ministry. I was even at the point when I thought about going back into ministry, I actually started having anxiety attacks. Yeah. And then looking back, God really did something that I was not expecting at all, because we came back in January. There's no pandemic yet. And on the way driving here, I was just like, okay, I'm going to get back into church, just be a member. I want to get like into Bible study, and I want to just be with my old friends that I know are spiritually sound. And so I had all these plans in my head. Great plan. Yeah, Steven, I know. Great plan. I had all these plans in my head of how I was going to rebuild my spiritual life, and then immediately get here and no church, no one's meeting. There's a pandemic going on, and I need to try and find a job that's still going. Yeah. And so God put me in this like proverbial desert. I couldn't do anything on my own. None of my plans were working. Wow. And then finally, I was just like, okay, I just need to get back and start praying and start reading the Bible. And I eventually started working at the Dollar Tree warehouse. And I would listen to pastors on the way there and back. I would read the Bible, and I started in Psalms and just went through Psalms and then Proverbs and getting back into it. And God rebuilt my spiritual life in a way that I was not even realizing he could do.
And so it was just amazing to see how God was doing all of that in my life. And then so I look back on 2020, I was like, yeah, it sucked, but
Yeah.
God was really in all of it. I think I even got COVID in 2020. It lasted like a day, but either way, 2020 was horrible, but at the same time, amazing, and I wouldn't trade it. And because by the end of 2020, when I was thinking about ministry again, I was just like, okay, I'm not having anxiety attacks anymore. I'm actually starting to like get excited about ministry again, and I feel God pushing me towards that.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, the only way to know if I'm going to be really called back to this is if I start applying. And so I started looking for churches, and I started applying, and one after the other got an interview, but didn't go anywhere.
These are the churches that are interviewing during COVID.
Yeah, I know. Well, COVID 2021.
Yeah.
And so things are starting to get a little bit more lax, but yeah. And so the interviews came and went. I actually went through 9 interviews before Westview, and all of the 9 were for youth pastor positions. And I was like, okay. And so after the 9th, I'm like, God, okay, God, I guess I'm just not called to this. You want me to do something else with my life, at least for this time being. So whatever you want me to do. And so I started praying. And the next morning I got up to go to the Dollar Tree warehouse, and I was listening to a pastor, and he was talking about how he became a senior pastor. And it was this really powerful story of how God led him to it. And then finally he was like, yeah, and then I became a senior pastor. And then it was that hand again. I'm like, no! I literally screamed in my car, like, no, God, I don't want to be a senior pastor. And the rest of that day, it was, yes.
That's so funny.
I'm like, and what was also interesting was I had got on the Church of God's website to figure out who, or what churches were looking and everything. And I saw Westview in Longview. And I also was like, God, I don't want to move again. We're around our family. My son can be around his family and get to know them. And so I saw Westview, and I saw they were looking for a senior pastor. I was like, well, I'm not called to be a senior pastor. And I'm like, dang it, there's that one in Westview. Okay, so I apply, and I don't hear anything for like 3 months. And so I'm like, oh, I guess it's not. I'm okay, God, I applied. Nothing's happening. And then I get a phone call randomly one day, and they're like, hey, is this Steven Guinett? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, who's this? I'm like, hi, I'm from Westview Church. We emailed you wanting to do an interview, but we didn't hear anything from you, so this was our last chance to get a hold of you. And I'm like, dang it. And turns out they accidentally sent everything to the wrong email. And so I went and interviewed, spoke there a few times, and just how smoothly all of it went, and how welcoming everybody was. It was just, there was no way denying that this is where God was wanting me to be. And so
it feels a lot different than walking to a role as youth pastor, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people really want a pastor in their life. They really want a leader in their church.
And yeah, and through the pandemic and everything, that just became evident for everybody, because everyone was missing just being connected to everybody. And yeah, you can do church online, which all the churches tried to do, but there's no taking away from personal interactions at church. And yeah, people just want camaraderie, and they want that fellowship, and they want a pastor. And
how did it feel for you, having a group of people that you didn't know want you? Because they went after you.
I know. It was just kind of, really? Me?
Yeah.
Like, I was just a youth pastor for 4 years. Don't you want someone like more experienced and older? Because I'm 39. Like, last time I checked, I think it was 40% of pastors are under 40. And so I'm like, don't you want someone a little bit older than me? And but that's actually been another thing why God was calling me there. Because COVID hit Westview pretty hard. They lost a few members to COVID. And in the midst of that, they also lost their last pastors, not from COVID, but they moved on. And on top of that, all of their youth graduated at the same time.
Oh,
so they lost a
wow.
youth ministry. And then no one was meeting for the most part, even though they tried to do outside services. But so families, when churches were eventually able to come back and do services, they didn't have a children's ministry, didn't have a youth ministry.
Wow.
So
they got decimated.
yeah. And so, so this church really, the members really had to come together and have this like refining fire about, okay, are we going to continue to be a church? We don't have a pastor. We don't have or like really any ministries other than Sunday morning and Bible study on Sunday morning. Are we really going to do this? And they were like, yeah, we're called to be here. This is our church. We want to follow after God and do what we're meant to. And so they really rallied together, and the church dropped in the number of people attending. But so when I came in, it was just a group of people that wanted to do church.
Yeah.
They knew why they were there. They didn't have any qualms about how hard it was going to be. And so, yeah, it was kind of like really, all of you are that dedicated. You want me? Okay. And since
What
then,
did your wife say?
kind of the
what was
same
her
thing.
response?
Like, really? Like, oh, like, okay. Like,
She's just ready to go.
my wife had some reservations because she heard some, not some nice things about Longview.
Yeah.
But
What? Wait, what?
I know, right? And so she was like, Longview, really?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm like, well, if that's where we're called, that's where we're going to go. And since moving here, we're realizing like, oh, it's not as bad as some people were making it out to her.
No.
But yeah, it's been fantastic, and just an amazing, loving group of people that love God and want to do church and want to see the church grow.
Well, not only that, but you love God, and you're growing. And so it's like the Lord gave them a leader, a pastor, and he also gave you a renewed vision for
That's
relationship
actually been
with him.
Yeah, that's one of the weirdest things that's come out of being a senior pastor that I didn't have to do in youth ministry, not to, at least to this extent, was, oh wait, I'm the one casting a vision. Okay, what does that look like? And so I've told my church repeatedly, like, I'm doing a lot of this for the first time. And I'm bringing you with me.
Isn't that cool that you could say, I'm on this journey, come with me?
Yeah. And,
you don't have to try to fit
that was
into
the
a mold
first
or
thing.
something.
That was the first thing that I actually did when I got there, because I read this really short book in 2020. It was actually about youth ministry, and I can't remember the name of it now. But the whole premise of the book is coming in and surveying the entire church and surveying the ministry that you're in. And it was geared towards youth ministry, but its principle is essentially the same, is you evaluate the entire church and what's going on.
Yeah.
And that was the first thing that we really did. And I invited members of my church to be a part of that. And a number of people volunteered to be a part of that. And so we looked at every single aspect of the church, which at the time didn't take long because there wasn't really anything going on. But the thing that that God really hit us with at that time was, don't get complacent. Like, you got a pastor again. We're starting to do more things. Don't get complacent.
Yeah.
And in no way did the church look or feel complacent, because everyone had stepped up to do ministry.
Yeah.
And help the church get along. And so they were ready and willing to go and do. But there was this moment of you could have a danger of getting complacent. So we're not going to do that. Thus, we're doing an evaluation. Thus, we're really trying to make some goals for ourselves. And one thing that we also did was we, a few months later, we decided that we needed a new vision.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing. Invited anyone who wanted to be a part of that, and we created a new vision.
Can you say what it is?
Oh man. Our new vision is,
you don't have to word for word, but
yeah,
like,
our new vision is life together, faith together, life together, grow together.
Right.
And we have a defining statement with that, in that we're a Christ-centered church that seeks to make disciples amongst all believers, or disciple all believers, make disciples, and be out in the community showing love, empathy, grace, and truth. And anyone who comes to our church is welcome. All are welcome, all are loved.
And it's a neighborhood church too, so you literally can go across the street.
Yeah, we're right in the middle of a residential area, so there's houses everywhere you go.
Yeah.
And that was one other goal that we actually came up with, was like, we could reach all of Longview, but it doesn't really mean much if like our neighbors, like, love your neighbor. We have neighbors within just a mile of us, and a lot of them, let's have that be our focus. One of our main focuses is just be a blessing to this community around us.
Yeah.
And it's been a journey, and God has led us into doing more things, and really what that looks like. And so we're still developing that. But since when I came, it was Sunday morning worship and service and Bible study. That was it. And now we just, after 4 years, kicked off children's ministry, because we have new families in the church.
Yeah.
We are doing Wednesday night Bible study. We're doing young adult Bible study, women's ministry, men's breakfast. We have Embrace Grace. I don't know I think we talked about that. Embrace Grace as available at our church. And so there's a lot going on. And recently I was really bragging about all of that to my church. And I actually did it for 2 weeks. I was just like, man, God is so amazing. Look at how much he's doing. And then a few days later after that, God hit me like, Steven, how are you defining success at your church? I should say my church.
Yeah.
How are you defining success at my church?
That's awesome.
Yeah, if people aren't getting saved and people aren't finding Jesus, I'm kind of defining success, aren't I? So it's like, dang it. And so I actually just spoke 2 sermons on about that. Like, how are we defining success in our church and in our lives as far as faith? And man, it's been a blast to be at Westview, and the amount of love and support that myself and my whole family have received is amazing. My daughter Casey was born this year, and so they get to see our family grow, and a part of that is also amazing, because of course my son was really he's 5 now, but he was young when we got there, and so they've seen him grow up, and now they're seeing Casey come along, and now she's a walking machine. She was walking before she was just turned 1, and so everyone's just amazed at all of that with our family. And
you know what I like about this is, well, for one, that's an amazing story. I don't think I've ever heard a story that was as honest as that. You are an amazingly honest guy just about your own journey, which is refreshing and inspiring. And I just know that there's a lot of people who need to hear that story, because there's a lot of frustration, I think, in people, because they're not where they want to be. Their church is not where they want it to be. Mm-hmm. Their lives are not where they want them to be. Their families. And so the whole story that you tell is a story of restoration.
Yeah. And I have to give all glory to God with it, because I am not smart enough or wise enough to do any of it. So I have to give all glory to God. And a part of one thing I've learned over my time in ministry, and just in my life in general, but especially in ministry, is a lot of the pastors I grew up with, they seemed almost larger than life.
Yeah.
Like, not necessarily like they weren't approachable, but it was kind of this like, it's the pastor.
You had to get through the pastor label, yeah.
Yeah, kind of like that. So it always just seemed like they had their pastor hat on. And one thing that I've just noticed, and this was very evidently clear in youth ministry, because if you're not being honest and genuine with youth, they pick up on it.
Yeah.
And so that's just really carried over in a lot of my life, and that people like this one guy was like, "What were you expecting, a sweater vest?" Like, I'm not that kind of pastor. Like, I'll tell you my whole life story, and I'll just be honest with you and real, and
It'll be
all
in a
of my
hoodie.
struggles, and in a hoodie. And that's the thing. I hate wearing suits.
Good for you.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to get my church to be okay with me wearing a t-shirt on stage. I don't think they'd have a problem with it, but
You'll know.
yeah. And that was the one thing I asked my church, like, is there anything off limits in the interview process? Is there anything off limits, like not to touch when it comes to the church? And they're like, no. I'm like, I'll find something. And sure enough, I find a few things.
Yeah.
But every church is that way. But yeah, people just really want to, what I've noticed is that they don't trust suits anymore.
Yeah.
For a whole lot of reasons. And two, they want to know people are struggling with things. And if I can't be honest with my struggles,
Yeah.
and I can't share my struggles with my church and with anybody else, how can I expect them to share theirs?
Yeah.
And so
That's so good.
And like with my pastor, when we were doing that extra interview, and he was like, I didn't sleep either. Like, that was one of the moments that I cherished the most in that he was edifying everything I was feeling.
Yeah.
And there was one other moment that I look back in my church in Minnesota like that. In my wife and I had a miscarriage in our first child. Hardest thing I've ever been through. Because we spent several years actually not being able to get pregnant, and then got pregnant, all excited. 2 days later, we found out.
Oh, wow.
And so it was just this amazing high to this amazing low. And we shared that at our church in Minnesota and Westview. Now we have a praise and prayer time before my sermon, in that people can share their praises, what God's doing, and also their prayer requests. And it's an amazing time to see God answering prayers, but also how we can be a church that prays and prays for each other. Well, we shared that at Sunday morning in Minnesota after we found out about the miscarriage, and a good friend of mine walks over and gives me a hug after service. The guy, I don't think I've ever seen the guy hug his wife in public.
Wow.
And so him coming over and giving me a hug was one of the most amazing things I ever felt at that church. And just a love from a fellow believer who's been there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if I can't be honest with my struggles and honest with what's going on in my life, I can't expect my church or anyone else I meet to be honest with theirs. And it also opens, what I've noticed, it opens the door in a way that it doesn't anything else. It's like, man, I'm dealing with XYZ.
Yeah.
Like right now, God is really challenging me on this particular thing. Oh, yeah, I'm dealing with this. Awesome. Let's talk about that. And yeah, it's something I felt God has continuously pushed, is just be honest and real with people.
It's such a healthy way to pastor a church too. It's healthy for you. It's healthy for the church. It's healthy for the kids that are growing up in the church to see that kind of honesty and openness. Listen, thank you so much. Thank you for doing this interview. Thank you for sitting down and taking the time to be honest with me and with us. And I am really glad you're here. Really, Steven, I'm glad you're pastoring in the city. I hope that you get inundated with people who just want to sit down over coffee and tell you their journey too. Because I think that one of the things that honesty gives you a curiosity about other people's stuff too. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for everything we did today.
It was a lot of fun being here.
All right.